Fake news, post-truth, alternative facts, conspiracies, bot-generated posts, lies, lies, lies. When will it stop? We are living in an exciting and also disorienting time when truth, it seems, is up for grabs. In Democracy and Truth, A Short History, Professor Sophia Rosenfeld explains that a crisis of truth is not new, and that democracy has always, at least in its modern forms, had to find a way to mediate expert knowledge, held by the elites, with the wisdom of the crowds and common sense. How can we define the truth in a democracy when everyone's opinion is supposed to matter equally? Is the current political climate truly different from earlier times, when people lied to gain advantage, politicians concealed things to protect themselves, their party, or the country, and people had a healthy distrust of educated, powerful elites? I spoke with Professor Rosenfeld, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania and is also the author of Common Sense, A Political History, A Revolution in Language, Science in Late 18th Century France, and Democracy and Truth, A Short History.
Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. Welcome. I'm really happy to have Sophia Rosenfeld here. I guess you go by Sophie, is that right?
I go by either one.
Oh, Sophia. So Professor Rosenfeld is the Walter Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. You've written several books. One of them is the history of the idea of common sense, a political history. One is the use of language in late 18th century France, right before the revolution, kind of a revolution in language. And then the book I just read for the last couple of days, I was really excited to receive, is called Democracy and Truth, A Short History. And the book now, as you can see, it looks like a piñata. I have so many little Post-it notes in it.
Super.
So first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
The book gives a kind of history of the last 200 years from the great revolutions, the French and American Revolution specifically, where the people assume power rather than monarchs or rulers. And you try to give a deeper sense of what is the rule of truth in democracy. In today's age, today Michael Cohen is testifying before Congress right now while we speak. We live in an age of post-truth, alternative facts, fake news, conspiracy theories, and people saying whatever they want, it seems, and people having a hard time deciding how do you assess what's true, what's false. But you go back to the early 1800s and say there's always been a complicated relationship between truth and democracy.
Yes, I mean, even the Michael Cohen testimony today is actually interesting because on the one hand, you think here's a liar testifying about other lies that he told on behalf of other liars, and it's lies all the way down, except that we still are invested enough in the ritual of trying to get to the bottom and discern the truth that, in fact, this procedure's happening as part of American democratic practice. So there is a kind of dualism, I think, built into American and really all democratic politics from the beginning, which is to say there's a great premium placed on the importance of truth, that people should operate out of truth, that democratic governance should even result in truth, and yet that truth is always left open-ended in a certain way, so that it's a perennially contested thing. Where is it? How do you find it? Who gets to say what it is? And what do you do with it once you know what it is?
In your book, you talk quite a bit about who gets to find it and who gets to define it. And there's sort of two groups. But before we get to that, what you just said, there's an assumption that truth matters in democracy.
Yes.
It's really important. Why is it so important? Why couldn't we just have a democracy and truth is something that's done on the side, that's done by other people somewhere, but it's not really essential to political life?
Yes, it's an interesting thing. I think it's an artifact of the Enlightenment in part because it isn't essential, really, that truth be at the heart of politics. Politics can be about power. It can be about all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be about truth. But the thinking about republics starting in the 18th century was premised not just on the idea that truths would be good for republics, but that republics would be good for truth, that this was a particular form of government that would help in the process of not laying down truths from on high, but building up truths through a kind of give and take in some sort of open forum that would, in the end, take us closer to knowing more about the world than we might otherwise.
And there's two parts when you say the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant figures in your book sort of a moment in this famous little essay, What is Enlightenment? You refer to him and say, what is he saying here? What does that have to do with being a citizen in a democracy or in a republic? Because he's basically speaking to philosophers. You point that out.
Yes. It's an interesting text because there's an awful lot going on, and some of it looks very familiar to us and some of it looks very strange to us in this famous little essay, What is Enlightenment?, in which Kant famously says, dare to know. And to know is, in a sense, knowledge is about getting at truth in some form. And the essay as a whole is really about how do you get there. And it's an argument largely for the deregulation of speech at one level, about allowing more people to weigh in more different ways, with the idea that if you hear multiple voices, that there isn't an orthodoxy on any topic that's enforced from above, you might, in the end, get closer to real knowledge, not just handed down received wisdom that might be traditional, but wrong-headed in some way.
And why is Kant so concerned that we would believe in things that other people have handed us, or superstition, or, I mean, I can't understand everything about the world, so I rely on lots of experts and other people to tell me, both experts, so I'm talking to you right now because I don't really know enough about the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalists,
Right.
so why shouldn't I just hand over some part of this work to other people and say, I'm done, it's fine, I don't need all this truth, I just need to get through my life?
We all have this problem, and I think it's much worse today than in the age of sort of generalists. Kant was more of a generalist than we are today. There's way too much to know, and the only way we can know things most of the time is by relying on somebody else, and often somebody else we don't know, and we only know from their credentials, or we know from the institution that they belong to. I can't tell you that the planet is warming, but if I read enough reports from what seem to be, impressively credentialed sources, I'm probably going to conclude that the best guess I have is that they are correct. I can only really measure the temperature in my own backyard or something like that. And in Kant's day, too, I don't think he thought anyone could know everything, but he did believe in a kind of healthy skepticism about official truth that's also important for democracy. So that's another way in which we're always sort of saying, yes, but. On the one hand, we do need to trust experts, because to decide that you can know everything on your own is obviously a deeply mistaken belief in this day and age, especially with the plethora of complex ideas out there and data. But on the other hand, a basic Enlightenment principle still holds that a certain amount of skepticism is necessary, that we shouldn't accept that anything we read, anything we hear is true on the surface. We need to do our kind of due diligence to figure out what's something we can at least moderately rely on and what we should reject out of hand.
So Kant's text is a philosophical text, as you write in the book, is written for experts, for other philosophers. Mm-hmm. But it contains the kernel of what it would become to be a citizen in democracy, that you're supposed to rely on yourself to a point. You have that courage to know something, because this is the only way in which you can create a legitimate republic, that the people think for themselves, in addition to, as you said, having to rely on expertise. And then you chart this kind of history of this tension between these two ideas, the kind of wisdom of the common people, common sense, and the rise of expertise. And it's a really fascinating history that there's this tension in the beginning in democracy that we're living through today, right now, with a few factors you're going to point out later that have changed maybe the whole situation.
Yeah, and of course, Kant is initially talking about a republic of letters, not a republic in a political sense, which is interesting because he still imagined a monarchy behind all of this, a kind of tolerant monarchy. But in a republic of letters, the number of people participating was bound to be more restricted. Fewer people were literate to begin with, fewer people were reading newspapers, and though he was sort of addressing philosophers and ordinary literate people at the same time, since his famous essays actually published in a journal, kind of a popular journal of its day, telling you something about the importance of the press already in the 18th century. But in a democracy, the problem gets sort of expanded tenfold, if not more, which is to say that, in principle, everyone has a voice. Mm-hmm. And that becomes, as democracies expand in the 19th and into the 20th century, becomes a pretty unwieldy place. And the number of sources of information has grown exponentially. The number of people who can weigh in has grown. And I think we always run the risk, on the one hand, of too much expertise, which is only hearing from people who've, kind of number crunchers in Washington or in universities or Brussels or something, on the one hand, or a kind of populist backlash on the other, which would say that no authoritative sources of knowledge are truly authoritative, that everybody knows as well as the other person, whatever the topic is, based on just daily experience.
And this kind of extreme relativism that you would say that all opinions matter equally, everybody is entitled to their truth, their opinion, is a real political problem because politics have to work on certain shared assumptions. Before we get to what's happening today, one of the other crown witnesses in your dramatic telling here is Hannah Arendt, who actually is a reader of Kant and comes from Königsberg herself and actually has quite interesting things to say what happens in the 20th century to the relation between truth and politics. But before we get to this, what happens in the 19th century? How do the founders of the American Republic or the people who want to institute a republic in France, how do they think of this? They're empowering some people, not all people, to have one vote, one voice, one opinion. So how do they try to balance this tension between expertise and common opinion?
Right, and it's a long-standing problem that really only grows. And you might say that the two big stories of the 19th century are the expansion of the electorate to the point where eventually you get universal suffrage, but at least at first you get universal manhood suffrage. On the one hand,
so it's a long 19th century
because
it's
1919
in America and 1946
women,
or 45
France is
in
really
France.
late. Exactly, it's after the war.
And in America, and African Americans get to vote in 1868.
Right.
So,
there's a wonderful and interesting history of sort of the discussions about who should vote that starts in the 18th century. It continues really to today. Now there are interesting questions about, say, should residents vote as well as citizens?
and what's the question? Who should vote? What would be the qualification for voting?
So that's really what's at stake, is not just who, but what. Is it a cognitive capacity to understand the issues? Is it a degree of knowledge that you need to know? Citizens, for instance, if you become a citizen from somewhere else, you have to pass a test about what you know about American life. When you're a native-born citizen, you don't have to know a damn thing unless
I had to take this exam.
There you go.
And
you probably know more than most Americans.
And my sister is a historian, and she didn't study for the exam because she's a historian of American history. And I said, why didn't you study? What if you failed? She said, if I don't know this, it would be a scandal. And I thought, well, if I failed, it would be bad for me. But I had to study up on democratic principles in America, divisions of power, all these things, the history of the country, to have a certain knowledge to qualify me as a full citizen.
Which is amazing because, for instance, most Americans don't know, say, how many amendments there are to the Constitution. But that's a standard question on citizenship tests. So there's always been a question about what does a citizen need to is it a certain capacity? For a long time, for instance, women weren't given the vote because it was assumed that they were dependent, that they had no independent thoughts, they didn't have independent sources of income. In early republics, servants weren't given the vote because they were thought to be also dependent in some way. So there's been a long conversation about who should vote based on what qualities. Gradually, there's developed a sense that most people, we still don't think children do. We don't think there are people who are certainly barred from voting. There's still an active debate going on whether former felons should vote or not, which is astonishing debate in and of itself. Florida just restored the right to vote to former felons. So there's a debate about who has the capacity that moves towards greater democratization over time, especially for members of minority groups and for women. At the same time, though, if you're thinking more and more ordinary people get a chance to say what's true, or at least what they believe, based on some kind of information, there's been an enormous expansion of expertise, both inside the government and outside. So the government does all kinds of things all states do that states once didn't do. Even 100 years ago, the state was a much smaller thing, and it relies on a huge number of consultants and think tanks and consultants to the consultants. I mean, there's an enormous industries built around supplying information, scientific information, economic information, information on public health, information on urban infrastructures, agriculture, in every domain of knowledge that you can think of.
And as most people would agree, I would like to have a qualified engineer